The roses Catherine had asked for were white. She told me that 3 years ago, sitting at the kitchen table after her first diagnosis, when she still had enough breath to plan things out loud. White roses, Frank, not red. Red is too dramatic. I had written it down on the back of a receipt from the hardware store and kept it in my wallet. The receipt was still there, worn soft as cloth, when I stood beside her casket that morning and looked at the arrangement the funeral home had placed at her left shoulder. White. Exactly right. I had arrived at St. Augustine's 40 minutes before anyone else. I needed that time. The church was cool and quiet at that hour, the way old stone buildings hold the night air longer than they should. I sat with her for a while before the doors opened, just the two of us, the way it had been at the beginning, the way it had been at the end. I held her hand. Her fingers were cold and still, and I held them anyway, because 42 years of mornings had made holding her hand the most natural thing I knew how to do. I did not cry. I had cried the night she died, alone in the kitchen with the lights off, and I had cried again the following morning when I found her reading glasses folded on the nightstand. By the time I stood in that church, I had moved past the place where crying lived and into something quieter and harder, something I didn't have a name for. Her wedding ring was in my breast pocket. I'd slipped it off her finger at the funeral home, with the director's permission, because I could not bear the thought of it going into the ground. I know some people would say that's wrong. Catherine would have understood. She understood most things about me, even the things I never said out loud. Father Thomas found me there before the doors opened to the congregation. He was 72 years old and walked with a slight forward lean, the way men do when they've spent decades bending toward people in pews. He had been the pastor at St. Augustine's for longer than I could easily calculate, and I had worked alongside him in a different capacity more than a decade ago. He came up beside me and stood quietly for a moment before he spoke. He didn't offer a platitude. He just looked at Catherine's face, and then he said, "She'll be greatly missed, Frank, by more people than you know." He paused, "And she knew who she had in you. I want you to know that I know that too." He shook my hand a firm, unhurried grip, and then he went to prepare for the service. I watched him go. I stood a little straighter after that, though I couldn't have explained why. By 8:30, the pews had begun to fill. I recognized most of the faces. St. Augustine's was not a large church. It seated perhaps 250, and on ordinary Sundays, it ran about half that. But Catherine had been known here. She had taught Sunday school for 11 years, organized the Christmas food drive for longer than I could remember, and spent the last 2 years of her illness still writing cards to the homebound members of the congregation when she could no longer visit them in person. The people who came that morning came because they had genuinely loved her. I saw it in the way they moved slowly, carefully, as if the air in the building were something fragile. I had taken a seat in the third row on the left side. That was where Catherine and I had always sat, not the front row, which felt too exposed, and not the back, which felt like hiding. The third row had been ours for 30 years. I sat on the aisle end, which left the seat beside me open, and the 3 seats beyond that. I had assumed David would sit with me. It had not occurred to me to assume otherwise. I heard him before I saw him. His voice carried it, always had, even as a boy. He was speaking to someone near the entrance, something brief and professional sounding, the way he spoke to everyone now. I turned slightly and saw him come through the side doors with Susan. He was wearing a dark suit I didn't recognize, well-fitted, expensive. Susan had her hand on his arm. She looked pale. David's eyes moved across the pews the way they always did when he entered a room, a quick survey, taking inventory. They landed on me. He stopped walking. It lasted only a second or two. Then he leaned toward Susan and said something close to her ear. I could not hear the words. Susan looked down at her shoes. She did not look at me. She said something back to him, brief, quiet, and I saw her shake her head very slightly. David's jaw tightened. He straightened up and put his hand on the small of her back, and they moved toward the pews on the right side of the church. I turned back to face the altar. I set my hands on my knees. I heard the shuffle of them settling into a pew across the aisle and 4 rows back. I did not turn around again. There was no point in turning around. Whatever I would have seen on David's face, I had already seen in that 2-second pause at the door, the calculation, the decision, the small, cold choice that a person makes when they have decided that their discomfort matters more than someone else's grief. The seat beside me stayed empty. Margaret Hollis, who had lived 3 houses down from us for 26 years, was seated in the pew directly behind me. I had not noticed her until I felt the faint movement of someone leaning forward. She touched my shoulder just briefly, just the tips of her fingers, and then she sat back. I did not turn around, but I felt it. I registered it the way you register small kindnesses when everything else has gone very still. From somewhere behind me, I heard a soft sound, not quite a murmur, not quite a breath. The kind of sound a room makes when it has noticed something and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. I had spent enough years on job sites to know that sound. It was the sound of people registering something they hadn't expected. I kept my eyes on the altar. The white roses were exactly right. Catherine had known what she wanted, and she had told me, and I had written it down, and here they were. That was something. That was not nothing. Father Thomas had returned to the sanctuary and was arranging his vestments near the side door. I saw him glance toward the congregation, the practiced, unhurried glance of a man who has presided over enough human moments to read a room without appearing to. His eyes moved across the pews. They stopped. I knew, without turning, that he had seen the empty seat beside me. I knew because I saw his expression change, not dramatically, not in a way that the congregation would have noticed, but in the way a man's face changes when he has confirmed something he suspected and does not quite know what to do with it yet. He looked at me. I gave him nothing. I had nothing to give. I was sitting in the 3rd row of the church where Catherine and I had sat for 30 years, in the town where I had lived for most of my life, and the seat beside me was empty because my son had looked at me and made a calculation and walked the other direction. There was nothing to do with that information except hold it, the way I was holding Catherine's ring in my breast pocket quietly, close, without display. The organ began. Something simple, something Catherine would have chosen. I recognized it after the first few bars and felt the melody settle into my chest like a hand pressing gently on a bruise. I had built things my entire life. Houses, mostly, but other things too, retaining walls, additions, the kind of structural work that holds other things up without calling attention to itself. I had learned early that the most important work was often invisible. A foundation done right looks like nothing at all. A beam seated properly just sits there, doing its job, and nobody notices it until something goes wrong. Catherine had understood that about me. She had never needed me to explain it. She had just known, the way she knew most things quietly, without making a production of it. I reached into my breast pocket and closed my hand around her ring. The church was nearly full now, 200 people, perhaps more, settling into their seats, setting their programs on their laps, speaking in the low voices that people use when they are trying to be respectful of something large and irreversible. The morning light came through the windows on the east wall, tall, narrow windows with simple clear glass, not stained, because the congregation had never had the funds for stained glass and had learned to find the plain light beautiful instead. I said nothing. I had not said anything since Father Thomas shook my hand, and I did not intend to say anything now. There was nothing to say. The empty seat beside me said everything that needed saying, and the room had heard it. And I was going to sit with that the way I sat with most things, straight-backed, hands on my knees, eyes forward. The organ continued. White roses at Catherine's left shoulder, her ring in my pocket. 42 years folded into the quiet of a Tuesday morning in a small church in a small town where most people knew my name, and my son had just walked to the other side of the room. I breathed in. I breathed out. Father Thomas stepped to the altar and the service began. I had built things my whole life. That was the simplest way to say it. I built things, And when they were done, I moved on to the next thing, and I did not talk much about what I had built because the work spoke well enough on its own. Catherine understood that about me from the beginning. She said once, early in our marriage, that I was the only man she knew who could walk away from a finished building without looking back. I told her I always looked back. I just waited until I was in the truck. 12 years ago, the First Lutheran Church of Harlan burned on a Wednesday night in March. Electrical fire in the east wall, they said, though the building inspector's report was more complicated than that. By Thursday morning, there was nothing left of the nave except the stone foundation and the iron cross that Father Thomas had carried out himself at 2 a.m, burning his forearm on the door frame as he went. I saw the burn scar later. He never mentioned it. The congregation met in the Grange Hall that spring, while the question of what to do next sat in committee. I went to one of those meetings. I sat in the back. When they got to the part about contractors and bids and insurance estimates, I raised my hand and said I would do it at cost. Materials only. No labor charge. Father Thomas looked at me for a long time across that crowded room. He said, "Frank, that's 18 months of work." I told him I knew. He said, "Why?" I told him Catherine and I had been married in that building. He nodded once and did not ask again. I started in May. I was up before 5 every morning, out the door by 5:30, on the site by 6. I worked until the light went. I came home with concrete dust in my hair and plaster on my boots, and sometimes I could not tell where my hands ended and the work began because they were both the same color by evening. Catherine always had coffee ready, not left on the burner to go bitter fresh, timed for when she heard my truck in the drive. 42 years, and she knew the sound of that engine the way she knew my breathing in the dark. I said nothing about those 18 months to anyone who didn't already know. That was not modesty. It was just the way I understood work. You do it. It gets done. The building stands. David was 26 that year. He had just started his residency at a hospital in Madison. He came home twice during those 18 months, once at Thanksgiving, once in the spring when Catherine had a scare with her heart that turned out to be nothing. Both times I was on the job when he arrived. Both times I came home late. The second visit, I came in to find him and Catherine at the kitchen table, and he looked up at me, the way you look at someone who has tracked mud across a floor you just cleaned. He said, "What are you working on?" I told him I was rebuilding the church. He said, "Huh," and turned back to his mother. He never asked which church. He never drove by to see it. I said nothing. He was tired from the residency and tired from the drive, and I understood that young men in demanding programs do not always have room for everything. I told myself that. I kept telling myself that for about 10 years before I stopped. He never knew what those 18 months looked like from the inside. He never knew about the morning in October when the scaffolding on the west wall gave way, and I spent 4 hours rebuilding it alone in 30-degree weather because my crew had another job and I had told them to go. He never knew that Father Thomas came out every Friday with lunch, a sandwich, and a thermos, and sat on an upturned bucket and talked to me while I worked, about the congregation, about the town, about what the building had meant to the people who had worshipped in it for 60 years. He never knew that when we opened the doors in November of the following year, there were people in that parking lot who wept. He never knew any of it because he never asked and I never offered. That was the arrangement, though neither of us had agreed to it out loud. Last year, I heard through Margaret she lives 3 houses down and has known David since he was in grade school, that he had been named chief of surgery at Mercy General. There was a dinner, a ceremony of some kind, his name in the hospital newsletter. Margaret showed me the page with his photograph, standing with people in good suits, smiling the way David smiles when he is in a room where he belongs. I was glad for him. I am his father. I was glad. Margaret also told me, gently, the way she tells me things she is not sure I should know, that when someone at the dinner had asked David about his family, he had said his mother was a schoolteacher and his father was retired. Just that, retired. Not a contractor. Not a builder. Not the man who had put up the church on Elm and the county extension office and the Harlan Public Library addition in 2009. Just retired. A man who used to do something and didn't anymore. I thanked Margaret for the coffee and drove home. I did not say anything about it to Catherine, because Catherine already knew, and it caused her pain she did not need more of. And because some things you carry quietly, not because they don't weigh anything, but because you have learned how to carry weight. I kept quiet. That was not new. I had been keeping quiet about David for a long time by then. At the funeral, after he walked to the other side of the room, I sat in the third row, and I did not move. I did not look at him. I looked at Catherine, at the white roses beside her shoulder, at the way the morning light came through the windows on the south wall windows I had helped reglaze 8 years ago when the original leading cracked. I know this building the way I know my own hands. I know where the floor settles near the baptismal font, and where the east door sticks in humid weather, and where Father Thomas keeps the spare key under the planter on the north steps. I built it back from ash, and I have cared for it since, quietly, the way I cared for most things. David did not know any of that. He never knew I still came on Saturday mornings to help with whatever needed doing: a loose railing, a leaking section of roof, paint in the religious education room that had gone gray from years of children's hands. He never knew because I never told him, and he never asked. And that was the arrangement. I held Catherine's ring in my coat pocket and kept my eyes forward. Father Thomas had begun the service. His voice was the same as it had been for 30 years, unhurried, careful, the voice of a man who understood that the words he spoke in this room mattered and should be given their full weight. I breathed in. The church smelled of candle wax and cold stone and the faint sweetness of the roses. I breathed out. I said nothing. I had learned, over 67 years, that silence is not the same as absence. You can be entirely present in a silence. Catherine knew that. She had always known that. It was one of the reasons I loved her, and one of the reasons I would miss her every day for the rest of whatever time I had left. The organ played. Outside, the January light was flat and white over the parking lot and the bare maples along Elm Street. Somewhere in the rows behind me, David sat with his wife and his life and his carefully managed version of who his family was. I sat where I sat. I held the ring. I kept quiet. The organ finished its last chord, and the sound dissolved into the rafters the way sound does in old churches, slowly, reluctantly, as if it doesn't want to leave. Father Thomas stood at the pulpit and waited for the silence to settle completely before he spoke. He was a deliberate man. He had always been a deliberate man. I had known that about him for 12 years, since the first week we broke ground on the north transept, when he came out in his work clothes, not his vestments, his actual work clothes, canvas pants and a flannel shirt, to move lumber alongside my crew because we were short a man and he didn't want us to fall behind schedule. He was 60 then. He moved lumber like a younger man. He looked out at the pews now and he said, "Catherine Mercer was a woman who understood what it meant to love something larger than yourself." He paused. The church was full. I had not turned around to count, but I could feel it, the particular weight of a room with no empty seats, the compressed stillness of people sitting shoulder to shoulder in winter coats, trying not to breathe too loudly. Millhaven is a small town. Catherine had lived here for 41 years. She had taught Sunday school in this building for 23 of them. She had organized the winter coat drive every November since 1998. She had brought food to Margaret next door every week for the last 4 years without being asked, without mentioning it, without expecting anything in return. This town knew her. These people had come to say goodbye to someone they genuinely loved, and you could feel that in the room the specific gravity of real grief, which is different from the grief of obligation. Father Thomas said, "She told me once, this was perhaps 8 or 9 years ago. We were sitting in the side office after the Tuesday evening prayer group. She said, 'Father, I think the most important thing a person can do is build something that outlasts them.' I asked her what she meant. She smiled and said, 'Frank knows. Ask Frank.'" He let that sit for a moment. I looked at my hands. The ring was still there, warm now from my palm. "I didn't ask Frank at the time," Father Thomas said. I wish I had, but I think I understand now what she meant. Catherine believed in work that endures, in things built carefully and meant to last. She found that quality in the people she loved, and she loved it without reservation. He spoke for another few minutes about Catherine, her patience, her humor, the particular way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them, the way she could make anyone feel welcome in a room without doing anything visible or dramatic, simply by being present and paying attention. He spoke about her faith, which was not a complicated faith, but a steady one, the kind that doesn't require argument or performance, just consistency, the kind you build over decades, the way you build anything worth building, one day at a time, without fanfare. I kept my eyes on my hands. I had heard Catherine described before, at other gatherings, by other people who loved her. It always sounded right, and it always fell short, because the person they were describing was real and three-dimensional, and the words were always just words. But Father Thomas came closer than most. He had known her for a long time, and he was not speaking from notes. When he finished the opening remarks, he said, "Catherine's son David would like to say a few words." There was a rustling behind me. I heard David stand, heard the soft sound of his dress shoes on the stone floor as he came up the side aisle. I did not turn around. I heard him take the 2 steps up to the pulpit, heard the small adjustment of the microphone, heard him clear his throat once. He said, "Thank you all for being here." His voice was steady. He was good at steadiness. He had learned that in medical school, I think. Or perhaps before. Perhaps it was always in him. The ability to sound composed when composure was what the situation required. It was not a bad quality. In a doctor, it was probably essential. He said, "My mother was the most important person in my life." He paused. Someone in the back of the church shifted in their seat. The wood creaked softly. "I want to tell you about a woman who never asked for recognition, who never sought the spotlight, but who shaped everything I became." He spoke well, I will say that. He had always spoken well, clear sentences, good cadence, the kind of measured delivery that made people lean forward slightly without realizing they were doing it. He had given talks at medical conferences. He had presented research. He knew how to hold a room. He talked about the time he was 11 years old and had pneumonia, the real kind, the kind that put him in the hospital for 4 days. He said his mother sat beside his bed for all 4 of those days. She slept in the chair. She brought books and read to him when he couldn't sleep, which was most of the night. He said, "I remember waking up at 3 in the morning, and she was still there, reading by the small light over the bed, and I thought I remember thinking that as long as she was in that room, nothing truly bad could happen to me." It was a good story. It was true I remembered that hospital stay. I remembered being there too. I remembered the chair beside the bed and the small light. I remembered Catherine reading. I had been in that room as well. I had sat in the other chair, the one on the opposite side of the bed, and I had driven to the hospital every morning before the job site opened and stayed until visiting hours ended. But that was not the story David was telling. The story David was telling had 2 people in it, David and Catherine. He talked about his medical school graduation. He said his mother had driven 6 hours to be there, had stood in the rain outside the ceremony hall because she'd arrived late and couldn't get a seat, had waited 2 hours in the rain just to see him walk across the stage. He said she was crying when he found her afterward, and he asked her why she was crying, and she said, "Because you did it, because you actually did it." He said, "That was my mother, that was who she was." He talked about the first time he saved a patient's life, a real save, the kind where it could have gone the other way. He said he called her from the hospital parking lot at midnight. He said she answered on the first ring, the way she always answered, as if she had been waiting. He said he told her what had happened, and she listened without interrupting, and then she said, "I knew you would. I always knew you would." He was building something with these stories. I could see the architecture of it. Each story was a brick, and he was laying them carefully, one on top of the other, building a monument. The monument was to Catherine, nominally. But the shape of it, the actual shape when you stepped back and looked, was the shape of David, his sickness, his graduation, his first save, his achievement, his success. Catherine appeared in each story as a supporting figure, essential and devoted, always present, always believing, always waiting. I sat with that for a while. I counted the candles along the side wall. There were 8 of them, all lit, all the same height. Beeswax. Probably. Catherine had always preferred beeswax candles. She said they smelled cleaner. David talked about her faith. He said she had raised him in this church, had brought him to Sunday school, had taught him that there was something larger than individual ambition, something worth orienting a life toward. He said she had given him his moral compass. He did not say where she had gotten hers. I thought about last April. David had driven up for the weekend, one of his rare visits, the kind that gets scheduled 3 months in advance and feel, when they arrive, like a formal occasion rather than a homecoming. On Sunday morning, Catherine had suggested we all walk to the 10 o'clock service together. She was still well enough then to make the walk, if we went slowly. David had said he would rather stay and read. Catherine had said, of course, and meant it. And I had walked with her the 6 blocks to St. Michael's while David sat in our kitchen with his coffee and his phone. When we came home, he had looked up from the table and said, "Good service." Catherine had said yes. She had looked at me, briefly, the way she sometimes looked at me when she was deciding whether to say something. She did not say it. She poured herself a glass of water and asked David if he wanted lunch. He had been 6 blocks from the building I had spent 2 years rebuilding. He had driven past it on his way in from the highway. He had not asked about it. He had not asked about it the visit before that, either, or the one before that. He had been not asking about it for 12 years, and each time he did not ask, the not asking became a little more deliberate, a little more settled, a little more like a decision rather than an oversight. I counted the candles along the side wall again. Still 8, still the same height. He talked about her cooking, specifically the pot roast she made every Sunday, which was, he said, the single best thing he had ever eaten, and he had eaten at some very good restaurants. The congregation laughed, gently, the way people laugh at funerals when something is both true and sad. He talked about the way she kept the house, the way she organized things, the particular system she had for the linen closet that he had never fully understood but had always admired. He did not mention who had built that house. He did not mention the 2 years it had taken, the weekends I had spent on the framing and the finish work, the summer Catherine had picked out every fixture herself, and I had driven to 3 different suppliers to find the exact faucet she wanted for the upstairs bathroom, because the one they had in stock was almost right, but not quite right, and she deserved the one she actually wanted. He talked about her garden. He said she had the greenest thumb of anyone he had ever known, that she could make anything grow, that she had a particular gift for roses that he had never seen in anyone else. He said the garden had always felt like an extension of her, patient and abundant and full of color. He did not mention who had built the raised beds, who had mixed the soil, who had spent 2 weekends in April installing the irrigation system so she wouldn't have to drag hoses across the yard in the summer heat. He said, "My mother will always be my North Star. She will always be the standard I measure myself against. She taught me what it means to give without reservation, to love without condition, to show up for the people who need you." He paused. The pause was long enough that I thought he might be finished. Then he said, "She was the best person I have ever known." And then he was finished. He stepped back from the microphone. There was a soft sound from the congregation, not quite applause, not quite silence, something in between, the sound of people exhaling after they have been holding their breath. He came back down the steps, and I heard his footsteps return up the side aisle. Before he reached his seat, Father Thomas spoke. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The church was very quiet, and his voice carried the way voices carry in rooms built for listening. He said, "David." Just the name said, the way a man says a name when he wants the name itself to do the work of stopping someone. David stopped. I heard it, the pause in the footsteps, the small silence where movement had been. Father Thomas said, "Before you sit, do you know who built this church?" The question was simple. The room received it the way rooms receive things that are simple, and also not simple at all, with a stillness that had weight to it. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I could feel the question in the air the way you feel a shift in temperature. The way you feel when something that has been held in place for a long time is finally released. David did not answer immediately. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then he said quietly, "No." Father Thomas looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at me. Then he said, "Sit down, David. I'll tell you." I heard David settle into his seat. I heard Susan, beside him, say something very quietly, too quietly to make out the words. I sat with my hands in my lap. He had spoken for 11 minutes. I know because I had been watching the clock on the side wall, an old clock. Brass face, Roman numerals, installed in 1987 when the parish renovated the nave. I had not been involved in that renovation, but I knew the clock because Catherine had mentioned it once, had said she found it comforting to look at during the long homilies, that there was something reassuring about a clock that had been keeping time in the same spot for decades. 11 minutes. Not once in those 11 minutes had he said the word father. Not once had he said dad. Not once had he said my parents. Catherine had existed in David's 11 minutes as a woman who had appeared fully formed in his life, devoted and present and endlessly giving, with no context, no history, no partner, no 42 years of marriage to a man who had sat beside her through everything. I did not blame David for loving his mother. I had loved her too, for longer and in ways he could not fully know. I did not blame him for being proud of what she had given him. She had given him extraordinary things. She had given him herself, which was the most extraordinary thing she had. But there is a difference between honoring someone and using them, between telling a person's story and telling your own story with their name on it. I had built enough things in my life to know that the difference between a wall and a monument is intention. A wall is built to stand. A monument is built to be seen. What David had built in those 11 minutes was a monument. It was beautiful in its way. It was also, in its way, a kind of erasure. I heard Margaret shift in her seat. She was 2 rows behind me and 1 seat to the left. I knew this because she had touched my shoulder when she sat down, had leaned forward and squeezed my arm and said, "Frank," just the one word, the way she always said things, simply and without decoration. Margaret Ostrowski had lived next door to us for 31 years. She had watched David grow up. She had been in our kitchen more times than I could count, had sat at our table and eaten Catherine's cooking and talked about everything and nothing the way neighbors do when they have genuinely become part of each other's lives. She shifted in her seat, and I did not turn around, but I felt her attention move from the pulpit where David had been standing, back toward me, where I was sitting. I felt her looking at the back of my head, the way you feel someone looking at you in a quiet room, steady and careful, and full of something she was not saying. I thought about a phone call she had made 8 months ago. It was a Thursday evening, and Catherine was asleep early the way she slept in those last months suddenly, completely, as if the day had used everything she had. Susan had called my cell, not the house line. She had said, "Frank, I wanted to call and ask how you're doing, not how Mom is doing, how you are." She had said it carefully, the way people say things they have been rehearsing. I had told her I was managing. She had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, I know it's been hard. With him, I want you to know that I see it. I don't always know what to do about it, but I see it." I had thanked her. She had said, "I'm going to keep trying." She had said it the way people say things when they mean them, and also know that meaning them is not the same as being able to act on them. I had thought about that call many times since. Susan was not a woman without conscience. She was a woman who had married a man with a particular kind of blindness and had spent years trying to find the edges of it without being able to name it directly, even to herself. That was its own kind of difficulty. I did not blame her for it. I hoped, in the way I hoped for things quietly and without expectation, that David would eventually understand what he had standing next to him. I kept my eyes forward. Father Thomas rose from his chair beside the altar and walked back to the pulpit. He moved the way he always moved, without hurry, without performance, each step placed with the deliberateness of a man who had learned long ago that there was no point in rushing toward anything that mattered. He adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the congregation for a moment before he spoke. His expression had changed. It was not a dramatic change. Father Thomas was not a dramatic man. But I had worked alongside him for 2 years on the restoration project, had eaten lunch with him in the shell of the unfinished nave, with sawdust on both our clothes and coffee going cold in paper cups, and I knew his face. I knew the particular quality of his attention when something had registered with him, when something had landed and he was turning it over, examining it from different angles, the way you examine a structural problem, not with alarm, but with the careful focus of someone who intends to address it correctly. He looked at David, then he looked at me, then he looked back at David. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. No one else would have noticed it. I noticed it. He folded his hands on the pulpit and looked down at his notes, and then he set his notes aside and looked back up at the congregation, and I understood that what he was about to say was not what he had written down. He said, "Catherine Mercer asked me, about 4 months ago, if I would speak at her funeral. She was not certain she had much time left, and she wanted to make arrangements while she still could. That was very like her to think of others even then, to want to spare the people she loved the difficulty of organizing things in grief." He paused. She gave me some guidance about what she wanted said. She was specific, as she always was. She gave me a list. He smiled, briefly. It was a very organized list. She had numbered it. Quiet laughter from the congregation. I felt something move in my chest. That was Catherine. That was exactly Catherine numbered lists. Clear handwriting. Nothing left to ambiguity if she could help it. The first thing on her list, Father Thomas said, was this: tell them about Frank. The church was very still. She wrote, and I am reading from her actual words here, tell them that Frank built this church. Not the original church, the one that burned in 2011, the one they are sitting in right now. Frank rebuilt it. He spent 2 years doing it. He charged us almost nothing. He said it was for the community. He meant it. I looked at the candles along the side wall. Still 8. Still all the same height. I want to be honest with you, Father Thomas said. When Catherine gave me this list, I told her I knew all of this. I told her I didn't need to be reminded of what Frank had done for this parish. She looked at me, and those of you who knew Catherine know exactly the look. She looked at me and she said, "Father, I'm not reminding you. I'm telling you to tell them, because some people in that room won't know, and some people who know might need to hear it again." He set the paper down. "So I am telling you. Frank Mercer built this church, the roof above your heads, the windows along the north wall, the floor you walked in on this morning. Frank and his crew rebuilt all of it after the fire. He did it in 2 winters and 1 summer. He did it without complaint. He did it for a fraction of what it would have cost if he had charged us what his work was worth. He did it because Catherine asked him to, and because he believed, as she did, in building things that outlast you." I was looking at my hands again. The ring. 42 years of marriage in a circle of gold that had worn smooth on the inside from being worn every day for 4 decades. I had not taken it off since the day she put it on my finger. I did not plan to. Catherine's second item on the list, Father Thomas said, was, tell them he never asked for credit. The room was completely quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. He didn't. Father Thomas said simply, I have never heard Frank Mercer mention the restoration in any context that wasn't directly relevant. He has never asked for recognition. He has never asked for anything from this parish except the opportunity to do the work well. In 12 years, I've never heard him speak about it in a way that suggested he thought it made him special or important. He fixed the boiler 2 winters ago and didn't tell anyone it was him until the third person asked. That is who Frank Mercer is. I heard Margaret behind me. Not a word, just the smallest sound, the kind that escapes before you can stop it. Father Thomas looked at the congregation for a moment. Then he looked at me. Not at the general area where I was sitting at me. Specifically, the way you look at someone when you are speaking directly to them and want them to know it. He said, Catherine's third item was the shortest. It said, make sure David knows. I did not look at David. I had not looked at him since he walked to the other side of the room that morning, but I looked now just once, briefly, the way you check a level after you've said it, not because you expect it to be wrong, but because you need to know. David was sitting very straight, straighter than before. His program, the folded order of service they had handed out at the door, was in his right hand, and his hand was closed around it, not holding it, but gripping it. The way a person grips something when they need something to grip. Susan had her left hand on his forearm. She was not looking at Father Thomas. She was looking at David. The man in the pew directly in front of David, I did not know his name, but I recognized him. A member of the building committee from the Restoration years turned his head. Not fully, not the obvious turn of someone making a point. The careful sideways turn of a person who has just heard something and wants to see how it has landed. He looked at David for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he turned back to face the altar. David did not move. His jaw was set. The color in his face was high and fixed, the particular color that comes to a person's face when a room full of people has just understood something about them that they did not know the room understood. It was not anger. It was something quieter than anger and harder to carry. He did not look at me. He did not look at David when he said it. He looked at me. Then he looked down at his notes. Then he looked back out at the congregation and said, "Let us pray." The organ began. People bowed their heads. I bowed mine. I thought about Catherine writing that list. I thought about her sitting at the kitchen table. She always did her writing at the kitchen table, never at a desk. She said desks were too formal for thinking with her reading glasses on, and her coffee going cold beside her, writing out what she wanted said at her own funeral, numbered, clear, specific, thinking about everyone else even then, making sure the important things were said because she knew, as she always knew, that if she left it to chance, they might not be. She had known David would speak. She had known what David would say. She had known what David would not say, and she had made arrangements, quietly and without drama, to make sure the full picture was there, not to embarrass anyone, not to settle scores, simply because she believed in accuracy, in giving things their right name, in making sure that what was true was also visible. I had loved her for 42 years. I had not loved her perfectly. I had worked too many long hours in too many of those years, had come home too tired too often, had missed things I should not have missed, but I had loved her consistently. The way you build a good foundation, not with grand gestures, but with daily presence, with showing up, with doing the work, even when the work was invisible and no one was watching, and there was no particular reward for doing it right, except that it was done right. She had known that. She had always known that. And she had made sure, even from the end of her life, that someone else would say so. The prayer ended. Father Thomas concluded the formal portion of the service and indicated that the congregation should remain seated for the committal prayers before the procession to the cemetery. People shifted, resettled. Someone behind me was crying quietly. I could hear it. The careful, controlled kind of crying that people do in public when they are trying not to be noticed. I sat where I sat. I held the ring. I did not look at David. I did not look at Margaret. I looked at the altar and the candles and the windows along the north wall, the ones with the pale winter light coming through them, the ones I had helped install on a cold February morning 12 years ago when the temperature was 11 degrees and we worked in gloves and my hands were so cold by noon that I could barely feel the wrench. We had gotten them level on the first try. I remembered that. The windows were perfectly level, and Father Thomas had come out to look and said, "Frank, how did you do that in this cold?" And I had said, "Carefully." And he had laughed, and we had gone inside for coffee. The windows were still level. I had looked when I walked in this morning. I always looked. Old habit. Father Thomas had been standing at the pulpit for the last several minutes, And I had been watching him the way I watched most things in that building, the way you watch something you built, checking for small shifts, small signs of wear. The pulpit was solid. I had reinforced the base myself. 6 years ago, when the original joinery had started to separate, Father Thomas didn't know that. He had just noticed one morning that the wobble was gone, and when he mentioned it to me after Mass, I told him the wood had probably settled. He had looked at me for a moment, then nodded, and we had left it at that. He was 72 years old, and he had been the pastor of St. Michael's for longer than David had been alive. He wore his age the way certain buildings do, not as deterioration, but as evidence. Evidence of weather endured, of weight carried, of things that had not broken when they should have. I had always respected him for that. David had finished speaking 20 minutes earlier. He had stood at the same pulpit and talked about his mother for 11 minutes. I know because I had watched the clock on the north wall, the clock I had remounted after the restoration. 2 inches higher than the original position because the sight lines from the back pews were poor, and Father Thomas had mentioned it twice without ever asking anyone to fix it. I had fixed it on a Tuesday in March, before anyone arrived for morning prayer. David had said good things about Catherine. I want to be clear about that. He had said she was warm, that she was generous, that she had driven him to every practice and every appointment and every early morning obligation of his childhood. He said she had believed in him when no one else did. He said the word sacrificed 3 times. He was not wrong about any of it. Catherine had done all of those things, and she had done them without complaint. And she had done them because she loved our son in the specific and consuming way that she loved everything she decided to love. But David had not mentioned that she sat in the 3rd pew from the front every Sunday for 41 years. He had not mentioned that she ran the bereavement committee for 17 of those years, organizing meals for families who had lost someone, coordinating schedules, making phone calls at 10 o'clock at night to make sure no one ate alone on the day they buried someone they loved. He had not mentioned the Christmas pageants she had sewn costumes for, or the fundraiser she had organized in 2009 that kept the parish school's music program from being cut entirely. He had not mentioned any of that, and I did not think it was because he had forgotten. I thought it was because he had not known, and I did not think that was entirely his fault. Catherine had not told him. She did not talk about the things she did. Neither do I. It is one of the ways we were suited to each other. Father Thomas stepped back to the pulpit. The movement was deliberate, unhurried. He did not reach for notes. He gripped both sides of the pulpit the way he always did, the way I had watched him do 100 times. And he looked out at the congregation for a moment before he spoke. "Before we close," he said, "I want to say one thing." The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when the person speaking has earned the right to silence, not the performed quiet of an audience waiting for entertainment, the actual quiet of people who trust that what comes next will matter. I was still looking at the windows along the north wall. February light, pale and clean, and coming through glass that I had helped set level on a morning when the temperature was 11 degrees and my hands had stopped working properly by noon. 12 years ago, Father Thomas said, this building burned. I looked down at my hands. Most of you remember that. Those of you who were here remember standing in the parking lot watching the east wing come down, and some of you remember what was said afterward, that we would have to sell the land, that the congregation was too small, the diocese too stretched, and that St. Michael's, after 93 years, would close. He paused. A man came to see me 3 days after the fire. He sat in my office. We were meeting in the rectory because the office was gone, and he said he wanted to rebuild the church. I told him what the estimate said. I told him what the diocese had told me. He listened to all of it, and then he said that the estimates were wrong, that he could do it for less, and that he would not charge for his labor, only materials. He said it would take 18 months. Someone in the back of the church shifted in their pew. The sound was very small in that room. It took 16 months, Father Thomas said. He was here before sunrise most mornings. He was here after dark most evenings. I brought him coffee in December because he would not stop working long enough to come inside and get it himself. He never asked for recognition. He never asked for anything except to be left alone to do the work. I was looking at my hands. Catherine's hands had been cold at the end, and I had held them anyway. And I was thinking about that, about the specific weight of her hand in mine, about the way she had always reached for my hand when she was tired, not when she was frightened, only when she was tired, as if my hand were a place she could rest. "That man," Father Thomas said, "is sitting in this church today." I heard the shift in the room, not sound, exactly. Pressure, the way air moves when attention moves. He is sitting in the third pew. His name is Frank Mercer. I did not look up. He still comes, every few weeks, sometimes every week. He checks the foundation on the east side where the drainage has always been difficult. He repointed the stonework on the north face 2 summers ago without telling anyone he was going to do it. I found out because Margaret Ellison called me to ask who the man was working on the church wall at 6 in the morning, and I told her it was Frank, and she said, "Well, someone should thank him." And I said I had tried. And she said, "What did he say?" And I told her he said the mortar was substandard and he was fixing it. A small sound moved through the congregation, not laughter exactly, something quieter, recognition. I heard Margaret. She was 4 rows behind me and 1 seat to the left, and I heard her begin to clap. A single, deliberate sound, then another, then the woman beside her, then the man on the aisle. Then the sound grew, the way sounds grow in a room with good acoustics, which this room had, because I had paid attention to the ceiling height and the angle of the rear wall during the rebuild, and Father Thomas had asked me once why I had changed the original specifications, and I had told him the original specifications were wrong. The applause filled the church. I did not look up. I kept my eyes on my hands, on the place where Catherine's hand had rested in mine for 41 years. And I let the sound move around me, the way water moves around something fixed. Father Thomas waited for the applause to settle. He was patient. He had always been patient. "Catherine," he said, when the room was quiet again, talked about Frank's work on this church the way some people talk about cathedrals, not with grandiosity, with a kind of quiet certainty. She said to me once this was perhaps 7 or 8 years ago. We were talking after the Thursday evening service, she said, "Father, Frank never mentions what he built, but I know what he built, and I want you to know that I know." He stopped. I thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. I want you to know that I know. It seemed to me then, and it seems to me now, that this is one of the most important things one person can say to another. Not "I am proud of you," not "everyone will see what you have done." Simply, I know. I see it. I have always seen it. The room was very quiet. I looked up then, not at Father Thomas, not at the congregation. I looked at the windows along the north wall, at the pale winter light coming through them, at the lead lines that I had set by hand on a morning when the cold had made every movement deliberate and slow and necessary. They were still level. I had looked when I walked in. I always looked. To my left, in the first pew, David had not moved. Susan was beside him, and I could see from the angle of her posture that she had turned slightly toward him, the way a person turns when they are watching someone they are worried about. David was looking straight ahead. His jaw was set. There was color in his face that had not been there 20 minutes ago. A high, fixed color that I recognized, not anger, not grief, something else. The particular expression of a man who has just understood that a room full of people knows something he did not know, and has known it for years, and that his not knowing was visible to all of them before it was visible to him. He did not look at me. Father Thomas stepped back from the pulpit. The movement was final, unhurried. He folded his hands and looked out at the congregation one more time, and then he looked directly at me, and I held his gaze for a moment, and then I looked back down at my hands. The applause came again, briefer this time, and then it faded, and the church returned to the business of grief, the quiet, necessary business of sitting together in a room where someone is absent and learning to carry the new weight of that absence. Margaret leaned forward from her pew and touched my shoulder. She did not say anything. She just touched my shoulder and then sat back, and I felt the warmth of her hand through my jacket for a moment after she withdrew it, the way you feel the sun after a cloud passes. I sat in the third pew, and I held the place where Catherine's hand had been, and I did not say anything, and I did not look at my son, and I thought about a morning in February 12 years ago when the temperature was 11 degrees and the windows had come out level on the first try, and Father Thomas had asked how I had done it in that cold, and I had said, carefully, and he had laughed, and we had gone inside for coffee, and I had not told anyone about it, and Catherine had known anyway, because Catherine always knew, and she had said, I know what you built, and I want you to know that I know, and that had been enough. That had always been enough. The people came to me slowly, the way people do after a service when they're not sure what to say, but know they need to say something. I stood near the side door of the sanctuary, the one that opens onto the garden Catherine had helped plant 20 years ago. The rose bushes along the south wall had been her idea, and they were still there, still blooming in October in the particular stubborn way roses bloom in the Midwest when they're not supposed to. Margaret was the first. She'd lived 2 houses down from us for 31 years, and she walked with a cane now, and she took my hand in both of hers before she said anything. She didn't say, I'm sorry for your loss, or she's in a better place, or any of the other things people say. She said, Frank Mercer, you are a good man. Then she leaned forward and kissed my cheek, the way women of her generation do when words have run out. I thanked her. I meant it. After Margaret came the others, people from the congregation I had worked alongside 12 years ago, people I had not seen in months or years, people who had been in the pews when Father Thomas spoke. A man named Gerald Vogt, who had been on the building committee in 2012, shook my hand for a long time without letting go. He said, I told my wife last year that this building would stand another 100 years because of what you put into it. I meant that. A woman I didn't recognize immediately and then did, Eleanor Schaefer, who had been the church secretary when we were doing the restoration, touched my arm and said only, We remember. I nodded. I said nothing more than thank you, and I said it each time, and I meant it each time. David found me near the garden door when most of the others had gone. I heard him before I saw him, the particular sound of dress shoes on the stone floor, quicker than usual, the sound of a man who has decided to do something before he loses the nerve. I was looking at the rose bushes through the glass panel beside the door. The light was going gray and flat the way it does in October in Wisconsin when the afternoon gives up early. He said, Dad. Then he stopped. He stood there for a moment, and I could hear him breathing the careful, controlled breath of a man who has been holding something in for a while and is deciding whether to let it out. Then he said, Dad, I didn't know. About the church. I didn't know any of that. I turned and looked at him. He was still in his suit, the good one he had worn to the service, and his tie was loosened now, and he looked younger than 38 in the way that people sometimes look younger when they are ashamed. His eyes were red at the corners, not from crying, I didn't think, but from the particular strain of sitting very still in a room for a long time while something you cannot stop keeps happening. I looked at him for a moment. He was waiting for something I could see that... He was waiting for me to say it was all right, or to say I understand, or to open some door that he could walk through and feel better about himself on the other side. I said, Your mother would have liked hearing that. He blinked. He said, What? I said, Father Thomas. What he said. She would have liked that. David opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at the rose bush through the glass, the pale yellow bloom. The last one, still holding on in October. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, I drove past this church 100 times. I never once asked you about it. He said it quietly, not as an accusation, not as an apology. As a fact he was saying out loud for the first time, testing the weight of it. I said, No. He said, I should have asked. I said, Yes. I did not say more than that. I put my hand briefly on his arm just once, just for a moment, the way I had put my hand on things my whole life when I wanted to check if they were solid, and then I turned and walked back toward Father Thomas, who was standing near the altar talking to one of the younger deacons. Father Thomas saw me coming and excused himself. We stood together for a few minutes without saying much. He asked if I needed anything. I told him I was fine. He said Catherine had been a remarkable woman. I told him I knew. He looked at me for a moment with the expression he sometimes had when he was deciding whether to say something, and then he said, "She was right about you, Frank. She was always right about you." I told him she usually was. He nodded once, and we left it at that. Susan was standing near the back of the sanctuary when I passed her on the way out. She was watching David, who had not moved from where I had left him near the garden door. She looked at me as I passed, and I stopped for a moment. She didn't say anything. I didn't either. But her face said what it said, and I understood it, and I thought she was a better person than she sometimes knew, and I hoped David would eventually understand what he had standing next to him. I drove home alone on the county road I had been driving for 34 years. The fields on either side were harvested and flat, the way they always are by mid-October, and the sky was the particular gray that sits over Wisconsin in the fall like a lid. I had driven that road in every kind of weather. I knew where the low spot was that flooded in spring. I knew the mile marker where Catherine used to tell me to slow down because of the deer. I slowed down there out of habit, even though there was no one to tell me to. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they have always had two people in them and now have one. I did not turn on the television. I did not call anyone. I went to the kitchen and made coffee, the same coffee I had been making for 42 years. The same ratio, the same time, and I drank half of it standing at the counter, looking out at the backyard, at the garden Catherine had kept, at the bird feeder she had filled every Thursday morning without being asked. Then I went to the bedroom. I opened her side of the closet. I had not opened it since the morning she went to the hospital the last time, and the smell of it was her not perfume, exactly, something quieter than perfume. The smell of a person who has been in a place for a long time and left themselves there. I stood in front of it for a moment. On the second shelf, folded the way she always folded things precisely, with the seams matched, was the green cardigan she had worn on Sunday mornings for as long as I could remember. I took it down. I held it in both hands. It was lighter than I expected, the way things always are when you pick them up after a long time. I did not sit down. I did not cry. I just stood there in the half-dark of the bedroom with her cardigan in my hands, and I thought about 42 years of mornings. And I thought about the way she had looked at me the first time I showed her the church after the windows went in, the way she had put her hand flat against the new stone and said nothing for almost a full minute, and then said, "I know what you built." I thought about all the things I had built that she had known about without being told, and all the things I had never said because I did not need to say them, because she already knew. I said quietly to the room, to the cardigan, to wherever she was, "You knew who I was." That was enough. I folded the cardigan back along its original creases and put it on the shelf where it had been. Then I went back to the kitchen and finished my coffee. The following Tuesday, David called. It was early evening, and I was eating dinner soup, the kind Catherine used to make, though mine was not as good, and I knew it. He said he wanted to come to church with me sometime. He said it carefully, the way people say things they have rehearsed. But there was something underneath the carefulness, a roughness at the edges of his voice, the kind that comes from a few days of not sleeping well. I had heard that roughness in his voice only a handful of times in his life. Once, when he was 12 and had failed an exam he had been certain he would pass. Once, when he called from the hospital parking lot the night he lost his first patient. I recognized it. I did not remark on it. I told him that was fine. I told him services were at 10 on Sunday mornings, and that Father Thomas usually had coffee in the hall afterward. He said, "I'd like that." A pause. Then, "Dad, do you think would it be all right if I came to see the building, just to see it? Not on a Sunday. Just I'd like to see what you built." I said, "Saturday mornings, I'm usually there by 7:30. He said, "I know. Margaret told me." I had not known that Margaret had told him. I thought about that for a moment, Margaret, who had watched David grow up, who had seen everything and said very little, who had been finding her own quiet ways to hold this family together for 31 years. I thought, of course it was Margaret. I said, "Good." I knew what the call was. I had been in the world long enough to know the difference between a man who wants something and a man who wants to want something. But the roughness in his voice and the question about the building that was something else. That was a man who had looked at something clearly, possibly for the first time, and found it difficult to look away. I did not know yet what he would do with that. Neither did he. But it was a beginning, and I was 67 years old, and I had learned not to confuse what I had hoped for with what was actually in front of me. I did not expect more than what he could give. I did not close the door. I said good night, and I meant it, and I set the phone down and finished my soup. The next Saturday morning, I was at the church by 7:30. The east wall had developed a small crack in the mortar near the foundation. I had noticed it 3 weeks ago and had been meaning to get back to it. I brought my own tools. I always brought my own tools. Father Thomas arrived at 8 and found me already working, and he brought 2 cups of coffee from the rectory and set one down next to my toolbox without asking if I wanted it. He had been doing that for 12 years. He stood there for a moment before he went back inside. He looked at the crack I was working on, and then he looked at me, and he said, "Frank." I said, "Father." He said, "I meant what I said on Tuesday, about Catherine being right about you." I told him I knew. He said, "I want you to know I would have said it regardless. The list just gave me the occasion." I looked up at him. He was holding his coffee in both hands the way he always did in cold weather, and his breath was visible in the morning air, and he looked like what he was, a man who had been keeping faith with something for a very long time and intended to keep keeping it. I said, "I know that too." He nodded once and went back inside. We did not talk much after that. We never did. In the mornings, the light came through the new windows, the ones we had set level on a February morning when the temperature was 11 degrees, and it fell across the stone floor in long rectangles, the way it had been falling every morning for 12 years, the way it would keep falling long after both of us were gone. I packed my tools at 10:15 and drove home on the county road. I slowed down at the mile marker out of habit. The fields were empty and wide and flat, and the sky above them was the particular blue that comes to Wisconsin in late October when the weather finally decides to be honest about what it is. Nobody had to tell anyone what I had built. Nobody ever did. That was how I had always wanted it. If you've ever built something with your hands that outlasted every argument made against you, you already know that the most permanent things are the ones that never needed explaining. The stone holds, the light falls. The work speaks in a language that doesn't require your presence to be heard. If stories like this one find something true in you, I'll be here. There are more of them. And I'll keep telling them the same way I've told this one quietly, and without leaving anything out.